Did Joyce respect that idea of allowing one's drives to help dictate aesthetics and dictate, let's say, art?
The sort of the idea of Nietzsche as advocate of Superman, whether seeing that as, yeah, this is something great that we should aspire to, or this is something that, like, this, a sign of the decadence.
Welcome to the Neutral Ground. This year marks the 100-year anniversary of the publishing of James Joyce's classic novel, Ulysses. Ulysses is a kind of meta-narrative, if you will. It has a substructure of Homer's epic, the Odyssey, and as Joyce's own hero, Leopold Bloom, is engaged in his quasi-quest, so too are we engaged in a quest of sorts. One of trying to read the novel. And if you've ever actually read through Ulysses, you know just how difficult it can be at times to maneuver through Joyce's Dublin world. But like most quests that are worthy of our time, there is a great reward at the end for those who see it through. In honor of this milestone, I've invited Joyce scholar Dr. Sam Slote to join us on the show as our guest. Sam is an associate professor at Trinity College, Dublin. He is the co-author of the annotations to James Joyce's Ulysses, which was recently published by Oxford University Press. In this episode, we talk about Joyce's use of multiple genres in the text, the influence that Dante had on the author, Joyce's wrestling with Shakespeare and how that altered the fate of Ulysses, and we discuss what Joyce himself might have thought about the phenomenon known as Bloomsday, which takes place every June 16th. A day where many people gather to pay homage to Joyce's work by walking the paths of Leopold Bloom. Luckily for us, you don't have to travel to Ireland to hit the subscribe/follow button. It's readily available right in front of you. Make sure you check out the notes section of the episode to learn more about Sam's work and for more ways that you can support the podcast's effort to promote civilized discourse. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Sam Slote. Sam, welcome to the Neutral Ground. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing fantastic. We have a great topic for discussion here today. We're going to be talking about James Joyce's Ulysses. And this year marks the 100-year anniversary of its first publication. You know, something that I love about this is that it's similar to War and Peace and Moby Dick, in the fact that it's one of those novels where when you finish it, you feel like you finished a quest yourself. And you want to tell other people that you finished it. At least that's how it was for me. I remember thinking, when this first time I read it, I was an undergraduate. I remember thinking, I kind of want to tell people I finished Ulysses. At least that's how I felt, my reaction. I'd like to begin by asking you about your first reaction with Joyce, your first experience. Was it kind of enchanting for you as well? Did it hit you right away?
Kinda, yeah. I mean, I made uh, at the time it seemed audacious, but in retrospect, it was a little bit foolhardy move of starting with Finnegan's Wake. But then sort of, yeah, that expression, that expression says it all. But yeah, it did sort of hook me pretty much from the get-go. And for a while, I was thinking it was just Finnegan's Wake I was going to do. But then a few months later, I picked up Ulysses, and so then that joined the fray.
That is amazing. For people who haven't read Finnegan's Wake or tried to at least read Finnegan's Wake, it's even more bewildering than Ulysses by quite a bit. But I could see where that would actually maybe catch you even more, right? In trying to figure out, what are you trying to say, Joyce? What is going on here? Going that route. I went the route of the short stories and then, Portrait of the Artist, and just made my way up to Finnegan's Wake. But I was still confused with Finnegan's Wake, to be honest with you. Well, let's dive into this a little bit then. The novel, one of the reasons why it's such a, let's say, a difficult novel to read, but enchanting, is that Joyce uses multiple genres within this. It's not a straightforward novel if you've never read it before. He goes into different ways. He uses music, he uses history, he throws a lot of different genres into it. Can you speak a little bit for our audience about Joyce's use of these multiple genres?
Yeah, I mean, one of the sort of things to you realize when you sort of start to study Ulysses is that the book Joyce had in mind when he began writing it is not the book that was ultimately published, that it changed course in several, perhaps significant ways over the 7 or so years it took to write. And that certain ideas that might seem fundamental actually were later ideas. And this multi-genre aspect that you signal is, I would say, one of them. That there is something called that Joyce called the book's initial style, which runs for the first 9 episodes, and the 10th it changes, which is a mixture of internal monologue and external narration, with very little prompting between there's not much in the words of he said or he thought, but you have multiple voices sort of set up like that. The indications are that in the early stages, that would have been the style for the whole novel, that he would have continued in that way for the whole book. But then 1918, 1919, he hits the Shakespeare chapter in the library. And that's when the conception, that's where I would locate this particular change in conceptualization. There was some that happened before, some that happened after, but when he's trying to grapple with Shakespeare, that's the first episode where you have an intrusion of dramatic form for one page. There's a little snippet of music that's given there in medieval notation. So it's in thinking through Shakespeare, this is what sort of opens Joyce out into multiple or into using different types of styles. And then the 11th chapter, this Sirens, the music chapter, is an interesting one because Joyce tried to imitate the quality of music in prose with rhymes, alliteration, trying to get all sorts of musical effects in there. He said after he finished working on it that music's now ruined for me. I can see through all its tricks. But we have, and this is part of a cache of manuscripts that came to light in 2002 and were previously unknown. One of them included fragments of an early draft of Sirens from 1917. And among the things that are notable about it is that it's written in the book's initial style. So that he had this basic idea for the music episode, but writing it in a style that imitates music came significantly later. So I think that would be a key piece of evidence that he opens the book out into more registers. You sort of put it differently, like, because Joyce didn't write many books. I mean, they're few, and they're all very, very different from each other. It's as if with each work he's trying to think, how can I take this to the next level? And that sort of explains the jump, I would say, between Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, but also between A Portrait and Ulysses, and between Dubliners and A Portrait, although there it's blurrier because the ending, the last few stories written of A Portrait, or rather, last few stories written for Dubliners, Joyce was already working on A Portrait. But Joyce has a tremendous facility with registering different types of dialogue, different types of voice, different types of style. And it's that he could have stayed as a naturalistic writer with a very good ear for dialogue, just continued working in the Dubliners mold for his entire career, and it would have worked out reasonably well. Although he wouldn't have been to have quite the stature that he does now. But he wants to sort of push that to a further level, and that sort of thing gets to A Portrait. And then where his use of free and direct discourse, which, should I define this?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. It's the term free and direct discourse was coined by the French novelist Gustave Flaubert, who was a great influence on Joyce. Flaubert was a great practitioner of the technique, but you can see antecedents of it before Flaubert, like Jane Austen, and talking with my medievalist colleagues, even Beowulf You can see it. The idea is that it's an external third person narration, but it's influenced, inflected, colored by the character or even the thing that it's being described. Like a good short example is the first line from The Dead. Lily, the caretaker's daughter, was literally swept off her feet, which is an odd expression for a supposedly objective, impartial narrator to use. But it's exactly the kind of expression that a caretaker's daughter might use. So just she's being represented in a way that's appropriate to her kind of vocabulary. And the perspective or the degree of, let's say, narrational empathy is variable. That sometimes it can be very, very close to a character and then withdraw to something that's more apparently objective. And this allows for effects of irony and so on and so forth. There's ways in which Flaubert handles it. So then Joyce, in the later stories that he writes for Dubliners, really clicks into this technique. And then this leads and then to a portrait with the fairy tale like opening. Once upon a time, and a very nice time it was, there was a nicest little boy named Baby Tuku. It's precisely because Stephen at the point is a 3 or 4-year-old boy of his father reading him a story. It's as if Stephen were the fairy tale protagonist of this. And indeed, this is just a brilliant line, and it's a good example of Joyce giving his readers a clue as to what he's doing. The clue is almost harder to spot, but there's the line, his father looked at him through a glass, which is an entirely appropriate expression coming from the perspective of a small child who's as yet unused to the accoutrement of optics and optometry. His father looked at him through a glass. But then that suggests this line, a famous line from Corinthians, through a glass darkly. And the full quote is, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. But now I'm grown, I see as if through a glass darkly. So when I was a child, I spoke as a child. That's what's going on in terms of the narration of that opening section of a portrait. And as Stephen gets older, the style, tone, vocabulary gets increasingly sophisticated. So the style reflects the subject matter. And so then Joyce's, I don't know what oversell is, proficient use of free and direct discourse in a portrait, that then leads into Ulysses. But then within Ulysses, his sophistication of using that prompts him to up his game and get more and more experimental. Hence the diversity of styles and genres that you get in the second half of the book. Because there are kind of two halves of Ulysses, the first 9 episodes and the second 9, the more naturalistic Ulysses and then the more modernist Ulysses. And then in 1921, when Joyce is finishing writing Ulysses, he's also revising the earlier parts for publication. To some extent, the revisions he makes on the earlier episodes are to kind of retrofit them into the book that it's now become. Like if you look at the Aeolus episode set in a newspaper office that it's punctuated by headlines, as if, again, sort of reflecting the setting in a newspaper office. It's told in a newspapery kind of style. The headlines were completely absent when Joyce first wrote that, and when that episode was first serialized in the Little Review. Joyce puts them in 1921 because that's the kind of book Ulysses had become. So he's sort of reverse engineering the earlier parts to at least partially fit in to the book that Ulysses had since become. It's these revisions are far from uniform. So there is still a little bit of, you can still see the seams of the transition, but that's, I mean, but it's also part of that sort of evolution towards that is the reader learning to read Ulysses. And that when you discover that this is the sort of thing that Joyce puts in later, you also then see a trace of Joyce learning how to read and write Ulysses as well.
Two things connected with that, I think, that you made me think of. One is I was very fortunate that maybe about 10, 15 years ago, I went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art and I got to see a wonderful exhibit of the works of Salvador Dali. And most people who think of Dali as an artist, they think of persistence of memory, right? Stuff like that. But his very early works were very small, very realistic paintings, and they're absolutely stunning. And he could have, if he would have stayed just with those realistic paintings, he still would have been known as a tremendous force in art. But he didn't. Like what you said with Joyce, I mean, if you read the short stories, they're absolutely beautiful. He could have stayed in that, right there in that genre, and he still would have been known as one of the greatest writers. But he pushed himself beyond that. Something that I wanted to ask you about, you say that things kind of shifted when he was working on Shakespeare and bringing Shakespeare into it. Do you know what was it about Shakespeare that sort of made him pause?
I have ideas.
Yeah, please let us know.
It's just because I've been sort of in a phase now where I see that episode as being a fairly key one in terms of Joyce's evolving conception of Ulysses. Because originally it looks like that episode would have been placed earlier in the book, but then it becomes sort of the ninth chapter. It's in the episode, Stephen is in the National Library of Ireland. He holds forth in this disquisition on Shakespeare. And the attitude towards Shakespeare is one of the big biographical differences between Stephen Dedalus and the Joyce that existed in 1904. That in 1904, Joyce was incredibly arrogant. And if he did not have the skill as a writer to pull it off, he would have been insufferable. And he is kind of insufferable anyway. And indeed, in this anecdote, will relate to what I'm saying. There's a story in the 20s in Paris. Joyce is just being very bossy, like, you do this, you do that. And then Nora says, Jesus, Jim, if God himself came down, you'd tell him what to do. So one of the key differences was that in 1904, Joyce was loudly dismissing the importance and quality of Shakespeare as a writer, saying that Ibsen is the true inheritor of the Dantean literary tradition. Shakespeare is just a hack, they're dramatic blunders. And then over the years, his opinion changed, and quite dramatically. In 1912 in Trieste, he gave a series of lectures on Shakespeare, including one on Hamlet, to sort of the Triestine literary public. It's one of the big lacunae in the Joyce canon. The texts don't survive. So no real idea what he was talking about there. We have traces of sort of a notebook where he's definitely doing his homework on Shakespeare. And it's a reasonable speculation, but only a speculation, that Stephen's theory in the Scylla chapter in Ulysses has at least some affinities with what Joyce said there, but that is a speculation. So his opinion changed considerably, and I think the key line to get it is Nora's, and this also will relate to her snide comeback line to him, that she told her friend Frank Budgeon, there's only one man he's got to get the better of now, and that's Shakespeare. And that's, in a sense, what Joyce is doing in Scylla, is that it's one-upping Shakespeare, but by becoming Shakespeare. It's not quite the anxiety of influence. In fact, it's an interesting way around the anxiety of influence. He's rewriting, revising Shakespeare, precisely because of Shakespeare's grand canonical status. There's indeed the line in Scylla, after God, Shakespeare has created the most. And then the way the quick way I understand that, and this is explaining one complicated thing by going to an even more complicated thing, Blake's poem Milton, where Blake has the line, there stood Milton forming bright Urizen. Milton creates the God who has created Milton. And that's a sort of the act of poetic creation, much as Blake is creating the Milton who inspired Blake, because the Milton in Blake's poem is not readily recognizable to other readers of Milton. But it's this idea of going through the big precursor and rewriting them to make them yourself. And this is it's a very complicated game Joyce is doing in Scylla, because you have Stephen's theory about Shakespeare and Joyce's theory about Shakespeare, and the two overlap, intersect, but they're not quite the same. And it's there are some gaps in Stephen's theory that Joyce, I think, sort of subtly points out to. But in brief, Stephen characterizes Shakespeare as an artist who, and this is quoting Stephen from a portrait, transmutes the daily bread of ever lived experience into ever radiant art. So the artist translates their lived experiences into art, which doesn't mean that they're a documentarian autobiographer. They take just elements of their real life and fictionalize them. So a portrait isn't Joyce's biography of as a young man. It's a fictionalized version of that. There are things from his real life that are there, but some more directly than others, some bizarrely inflected, like the opening scene in a portrait. Totally true. There's a line in a letter Joyce's father wrote to him in 1931, where he goes, "My dear Jim, I wish you a happy birthday. Do you remember the good old days when we lived in Brighton Square and you were baby Tuku and I used to take you out and read you stories about the moo cow that would take boys across?" She said that is an absolutely accurate memory. And of course, it also shows that Joyce's father never read anything his son wrote, not even the damn first page. But so Joyce takes that, but fictionalizes it within the sort of the medium of free and direct discourse. And so that there, in the ensuing discussion about Shakespeare, these two characters have talk about Shakespeare. Well, you know, of all the great writers, Shakespeare is the most enigmatic. All we know is he lived, died, and suffered. Not even that much. That is, we just know the facts about his life are practically non-existent. And then the retort is, but his plays are so personal. And I think the point is, those both propositions are not mutually exclusive. Shakespeare's plays can be deeply personal, yet tell us nothing about sort of the raw data of his life. And that's the kind of artist he was. And yeah, that's also the kind of artist Stephen is aspiring to be. And so you have this kind of theory of artistic patrimony that's sort of working in that way. And a detail that's not stated in the text, but I think is at the very least a happy coincidence. Hamnet Shakespeare, the son, his birthday was the same as Joyce's, set February 2nd. And so that, I think, also sort of is implied there. Now, one of the ways in which the arguments differ, or Joyce's from Stephen's, is in the first proposition of the argument. Stephen, it says, this is Shakespeare's motivations to write Hamlet, that his son has died, his wife is unfaithful. He wants to be able to play the role of the ghost and then confess his wife's infidelity to his son in this kind of spectral role reversal. Hamlet, your mother is unfaithful, so on. So according to Stephen, Shakespeare is a cuckold and a father of a dead son, which coincidentally, that's Bloom. And so Bloom is very much implicated within the theory. And obviously, Stephen isn't doing this. That's not part of Stephen's thinking, but it's part of Joyce's. And that's the thread to sort of untangle mixing my sewing metaphors here, but that's how you can distinguish the Joyce's theory from Stephen's in that.
That reminds me of Aristotle in Poetics talking about poetry as a more serious thing than history. It seems that Joyce would kind of agree with that idea, that the taking of the history and fictionalizing it in some ways creates a more truer event, let's say even. You mentioned, I mean, we talked about Shakespeare. Let's bring in another powerhouse here that you mentioned as well, which is Dante. Now, you can correct me on this one, but I do believe in Ellman's biography, he footnotes a conversation that might be apocryphal where someone asks Joyce about the great epics. And Joyce essentially says, I'll paraphrase here, that the only epic, really truly worthy is Dante's. And then when someone asked him about, well, what about the Odyssey? This kind of background for Ulysses, he kind of sweeps it away as not being that great or that on the same level as Dante. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what was it in Dante that Joyce so loved, and why might he have kind of swept away a little bit the Odyssey, something that was a substructure for Ulysses?
Yeah, again, I don't remember that quote offhand, but it sounds right. And you always have to take these kind of Joycean grand proclamations on as, if not wrong, that he might be trying to make sort of a point in a certain way. The way I'd answer that is, because I'm just going to open up another huge kettle of fish. Joyce was Catholic. And I mean, he turned against the religion, and this relationship with Catholicism is complicated. But I think the key line to get at it is Mulligan's line to Stephen: "You have the cursed Jesuit strain in you, only it's injected the wrong way." That he rejected the church in some ways, but not in certain fundamental ways. Indeed, in Stephen's argument in Scylla and Charybdis, he talks about sort of the Mariolatrous aspect of Irish Roman Catholicism as being just a kind of populist dodge, a screen away from the essential teachings of the church. So he's very much imbued with a strong sense of Catholic dogma, just in a highly idiosyncratic way. And that's not unlike Dante, who's creating, or in his mind, a very orthodox, like the orthodox version of it, and hubristic in that, like, God revealed this to me, not to that Cavalcanti clown over there. Gross paraphrase of Dante, but it's sort of that kind of forceful, self-involved reinscription of Catholicism that I think would have, and sort of the way in which Dante does it, as in the guise of an epic, and that he translates a classical form into this highly Catholic big C quest, as it were. And it's an incredibly sophisticated poetic work. It's incredibly beautiful. It's deeply philosophical. I mean, there are a lot of factors to admire. It's also, I mean, there's a line that I forget if this is Philippe Solers or Maurice Blanchot has this about Dante, that it's more foreign to us now than Virgil or Homer, that it's maybe more historically recent, but conceptually it's more distant. I think that's also a part of what would sort of the Joyce would find so impressive. I mean, it's also, I mean, Beckett too was also a very strong, close reader of Dante, but takes very different things from Dante.
This is perhaps a bit of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm curious about his connection with Catholicism. Then, was it, in your opinion, was it the demanding nature of it, the ritualistic aspect of it, the aesthetic, the performative aspect of it, of the priest with the at the altar? Was that something that spoke to him specifically, you think?
I think that's actually that's the least interesting part of it. My sort of sense is, I mean, and here I'm largely going by a portrait, so I'd be reluctant to fully ascribe Stephen's reasons for leaving the church to Joyce, but I don't think it's a complete dodge either. But that when he's offered the priesthood, which up until that point in the narrative is like what he'd been really aiming towards, that the offer rings hollow to him, because he would be making himself subservient to a different order, that he would follow his own rules, make his own mistakes. And that's why he makes a sort of the hard left turn away. And so it's the ritualistic, dogmatic aspects of it, which would have been especially strong in 19th, early 20th century Ireland. I mean, strong in Ireland, but well through most of the 20th century. So that's, I think, the aspect that he was rebelling against. It's the theological contemplation, the ways of dealing with mysteries, and the Jesuitical approach to logical organization to express the inexpressible. Those are the aspects I would say are what were appealing to Joyce. Geert Lernout has a book on this recently called Help My Unbelief, where he talks about Joyce as a modernist, not a modernist in the Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot sense, but in the sense that it was used in 19th century Catholicism of church reformers. Sort of, we can still be Catholic without being doctrinaire, and that free thinking was an allied kind of movement, and that would have sort of seeped into Joyce's consciousness when he was at Jesuit schools in Dublin in the 1880s and 90s.
Well, let's stick with that. Thank you for that answer. Let's stick with this idea. You mentioned modernism, and you mentioned kind of the reformative aspect of it as well. I was always struck initially when I first read through this, specifically by the Eumaeus episode. And the character that I connected with immediately was the sailor D.B. Murphy. And specifically, what I loved about it, because I had been, I'm a lover of epics. I love the epic tradition. I was looking for the Odyssey throughout this and wanting to find aspects of it. And where I found my connection, my way in, was in the sailor, because of that idea of, here's this braggadocious figure, larger than life. He read to me like the epic hero. And then you have this beautifully sad moment. And I do not believe there's anyone, certainly in the English language, who can make a beautifully sad moment better than Joyce. And a simple question to this sailor completely shuts him down when they ask about how old his son is. And he just pauses, and you can almost visualize it. He's sitting there, he's trying to figure out, and he kind of has this momentary realization that he has been completely separated from his son, like Odysseus and Telemachus. And I remember thinking, what does this mean? And that led me to look into that as a kind of modern moment of the reconfiguration of the epic hero. Who's more epic in that scene? Is it D.B. Murphy, who seems more like Odysseus, or is it Bloom, who's sitting there, who's talking with Stephen and kind of working things through with him? I would like your opinion. Could you speak a little bit on the aspect of the modernist influence on Joyce?
Well, I say the D.B. Murphy thing is a very interesting. There are a number of interesting things sort of related around that. I mean, first off, because he's a teller of false, of tall tales, and Bloom sort of sees through the deception. I mean, he's first taken with him with the mariner, all these. There's this epic tradition of it, and Odysseus being one of the few epics that he doesn't not directly invoke there, but obviously invoked by absence. But then he says, it's all bullshit. There's in the schema Joyce didn't. The schema have variable reliability, but here I think it's spot on that the correspondence for Murphy is Ulysses Pseudangelos, fake Ulysses, which is the title of a non-extant tragedy Aristotle mentions in the Poetics. We know it existed, no idea what it's about. The imposter Ulysses. So he's what you said, but there's the fake aspect. But then there's an interesting note Joyce has in one of his notebooks, which is really hits to the heart of the matter. Ulysses plus pseudo, so Ulysses plus pseudo Ulysses equal two imposters, because Odysseus is also an imposter, and it's precisely in the Eumaeus episode in the Odyssey, where he takes on a disguise, pretends to be someone else. And Odysseus is also a bullshit artist. And so that's, I think, the epic inversion that's going on there. Yeah, this guy he's a clown, he's lying, but that's what the ideal of the ancient epic hero was as well.
Interesting. I did not know about that. Thank you for that note. It's speaking with you, it's fascinating because I was very fortunate that I got to work with a team of Melville scholars, and we got to work on Melville's manuscripts and see the notes that you're talking about. Has anyone put together a kind of, because people love Joyce readers because they're very necessary. Has anyone put together a book of these notes on Joyce?
You mean his own note?
Yeah.
There was in the early in 77, Philip Herring, who passed away within the last year. he has two books on this. One is full transcriptions of all of the note sheets that are at the British Library. And then a few years later, he did a thing of transcriptions of some of the drafts that are at the University at Buffalo. So those are transcribed. They're newer, part of the cache of documents that I mentioned earlier that came to light in 2002 that are at the National Library of Ireland. They've made high resolution scans of them available so they can be accessed. And they've been partial transcriptions have been published in a variety of journals. So they're out there, but not in a consolidated fashion. The Herring books are very good. There's Joyce's note sheets at the British Museum, and then Joyce's early notes and drafts at Buffalo are very good books on the matter. In some places, they're a little bit out of date because these were done in the early 70s, but they're very thorough.
Yeah, because it's wonderful. I mean, in addition to reading their primary works, seeing some of these notes and seeing how they think just gives you such a richer understanding of what their thought process was behind the writing. And I did not know that this was out there so readily available. I'm actually going to look into it myself. It's phenomenal. Well, oh, go ahead, please.
Yeah, it's just also while we have almost all of Joyce's notes for Finnegan's Wake, we know that the number of notebooks and note sheets we have for Ulysses it's a small fraction of what existed. So that there are much more that would have been out there. For Ulysses, he had a fairly complicated and paper-heavy way of collecting material. He would take notes from the primary reading and then plot them in one sort of order of notebook. Then he would transfer notes to other notebooks where they'd be categorized by either the episode of Ulysses they'll go into, or if they're related to certain themes or characters. And sometimes a single note entry might go across several generations of notebooks before being used. So it's a very paper-intensive process that he had. We have enough to survive that we can sort of trace that trajectory, but we have, in terms of just the accumulation of raw material, it's really a small fraction of what he must have had.
Interesting. Yeah. So in that way, he's kind of similar again to Melville also in just collecting. Melville was a collector and put it all together. And actually half the fun was just trying to figure out how to connect all of the different notes and the handwritings, because Melville would actually use different colored, almost looked like crayon in a lot of sense, to kind of indicate different draft numbers of something like Billy Budd, let's say, toward the end. Someone else here too, though, another kind of powerhouse figure that I've talked about with others, Dr. Duane Armitage as well on this podcast, is Nietzsche, of all people. And in 2013, you published a fascinating book on Joyce's Nietzschean ethics. Can I ask you to talk a little bit about that relationship between the two?
Ask. I mean, what part of the argument is not primarily an argument of influence. That Joyce did read Nietzsche in the early 1900s, but I would say for the most part, his reading was along the lines of certain kinds of superficial readings that were very common in the English-speaking world at that time. The idea of Nietzsche as advocate of Superman, whether seeing that as, this is something great that we should aspire to, or this is something that like this, a sign of the decadence of this mad German philosopher. And that's the kind of reading that seems to be where Joyce would have been, like in terms of the use of Nietzsche in the Dubliner Story, A Painful Case. On the other hand, the argument I'm making is that while you wouldn't have had much in the way of direct influence, there's some interesting consonances between the two in terms of how they think of style. That Nietzsche is the big philosopher of multi-perspectivalism and multiple styles. He says, I have the most multifarious art of style known to man. And Joyce is the sort of, as I mentioned earlier, very fluent in writing in a variety of different styles and perspectives. So what I tried to do is sort of apply Nietzsche's ideas on that to Joyce's use of multiple style and multiple perspective. Because for Nietzsche, this is what leads to the sort of the ethical dimension of Nietzsche, that the truth as such may be unknowable, but that doesn't mean that certain things can't be known and that we can, figure out what to do. And so it's by embracing a range of multiple perspectives, yields a richer realm of perspective. And Joyce thematizes this with parallax, which is sort of the mental operation by which two flat fields of view are synthesized to yield depth. So the more perspectives you add, the richer picture you get, which doesn't necessarily mean that that is the truth, but it's not bad. So that's the way in which I try to approach what Joyce as a theoretician of style and perspective.
You mentioned that Joyce was perhaps fascinated by Nietzsche's kind of Übermensch, right, the Superman idea. One of the character traits of that figure is this kind of a truth in drives, let's say. Do you know if, because one of the, I had the pleasure of reading Joyce's letters, and they're very raw, and there's a lot of drive in them, actually, even to a degree. I'm curious, did you find any connection between, did Joyce respect that idea of allowing one's drives to help dictate aesthetics and dictate, let's say, art?
I would say no, that it still has to be a mental, calculated response.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I could see that. Well, let me ask you this too, because part of this too is we're talking about a celebration here of 100 years, and people, kind of like what I mentioned at the beginning, people tend to look at this book almost as a kind of epic quest itself, and then people will make pilgrimages as well on Bloomsday to try to walk the trail here. Why do you think that this text has stayed so strong for 100 years, and people, flock to this place as a pilgrimage?
Yeah. I mean, there are multiple answers on this. I think one key thing that Joyce has is that he's, at least from Ulysses onwards, he's very funny. And if Joyce didn't have humor, I don't think that this kind of sort of apparatus of sort of the cultural penetration that he has, Joyce in Ireland and elsewhere, would exist. That aspect is, I think, strongly attractive to it, that it's a way of that in combination with his attempts towards a very raw psychological honesty. And that without humor, that could be maybe a little bit too scary, unnecessarily intimate, or just depressing. Any number of perhaps more negative emotions. But I think the humor and the way in which it works, it doesn't get rid of that. It's all those factors working in together. Plus the very vivid evocation of a specific time and place. He said, if I could get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to every city. So it's through the specific you get to the universal. So you can have Bloomsday celebrations not just in Dublin, but in cities all over the world. It's precisely because, yes, we don't have a Sackville Street, but hey, look, we got the Champs-Elysees or Piccadilly Circus, and so on and so forth. So that it's through the hyper precise mimeticism representation of the way Dublin existed in 1904 that also can create echoes with places Joyce never went to. And so I think there's that. There's one time a number of years ago, we were walking down with my family in Sandycoats, the area of Dublin where the first chapter is set, and there were little street party people in Edwardian dress, were sort of looked like a fine old time. And my wife was trying to get a reaction out of me, saying, "Well, how do you feel about all these people doing this? And most of them probably haven't even read Ulysses." And I was about to, and I said, "No, I'm not going to be that guy," because it was sort of like the Fox News war on Christmas, like the sort of like you put the bloom back in Bloomsday. It's like, no, I'm not going to be that guy. It's like this is, I think, I mean, If they want to take this and make I use this as an occasion for enjoying a sunny day, why the hell not? Because that's a celebration of life in its own way. Just the book is just sort of the proximate excuse for that.
Again, this is an unfair question. I'm telling you ahead of time. The You've studied Joyce, though. You've read him over and over. How do you think Joyce would feel about Bloomsday celebrations?
Yeah, yeah, I thought about that. It's on the one hand, he and it depends on what mood he was in at the time. I could see him doing, let him. Or on the other hand, damn it, no. It's he was very sort of shifty on that. He liked the adulation. We just didn't want necessarily want to, have it affect him, as it were. Or that's not quite the right way of putting it, but he could be very prickly. There's the line about him, the injustice collector, but he could also be very open as well. So it would just depend on the mood he was in.
Well, over the year, these 100 years, so many people have read the text, and scholars continue to kind of decipher what's going on. Can you give us some areas of Joyce studies that are still excited about, people are still uncovering and reading?
Yeah, because you get the big symposium coming up in 2 months at Trinity. There's the environmental humanities has been a thing within Joyce studies for a while. Some very interesting work that's come out. Cognitive science has there's people working on that. The stylometric analyses. So there are a variety of different new approaches that they're sort of continually get. Always have new approaches. I mean, there's also consolidation of existing work and trying to sort of orient it better. For example, the letters. There's only about half of the extant letters have been published. There's a project underway to publish the rest online with very copious annotations. Newer editions, looking at translations to see sort of the ways in which Ulysses or other Joyce texts work, but don't work in and across other languages. So yeah, there's just encourage a variety of different new approaches. There's been some interesting work also on queer studies in Joyce as well. It's just one of a amusing sort of source texts for Ulysses was there is a magazine called Bits of Fun, a British magazine from the late 1910s. It was ultimately censored. It was very risque, and it included letters from cross-dressers talking about their sort of their fantasies and fetishes. And Joyce got a few issues of this and used it for a little bit of raw material for as the scene in Circe when Bloom has the temporary sex change, like a line that's bizarrely, and I mean really enigmatic. Like, it was Gerard who convinced me to be a true corset lover. Like, what is this, Gerard? There's no, but it's just that's from a letter in this magazine. So once you know it, once you know the source, that sort of falls into place. It was uncovered by a man named Peter Farrar, who was a British civil servant and a crossdresser, and he wanted to work on a kind of history of an underground history of cross-dressing in British society. So he did a lot of research, British Library. So he found these journals and went through them. And because he'd read Ulysses, those lines struck him as familiar. So that's how he uncovered the source. So yeah, there are a lot of Joyce is very eclectic in terms of the information or there's the raw sort of textual lexical material that he gathers. And it's like you can also then, it unfolds into a kind of, you could do it then a cultural history through Ulysses on that front. So it's uncovering the material, the material behind it. That's also, I mean, there's a lot of pending work on those fronts.
Yeah, that's an aspect that we don't talk a lot about in terms of literary criticism, is this idea of almost becoming a literary archaeologist, where you're trying to uncover these source materials, and there's very few feelings that are better than when you actually do make those connections and you find a source for something. And Joyce certainly provides ample opportunity to find these source materials. He was an incredible, voracious reader in that respect. You mentioned, I believe, there's actually a YouTube video of you, I believe, providing a voiceover. Yes, and of a fantastically done animation in the background
Oh
where you
yeah,
talk
yeah. It's
about
not my
choice.
voice.
It's not
No.
okay, but okay, that's actually really interesting because believe it or not, my wife and I were watching it, and I was saying I'm not sure that that's him,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, you provided, I think, the background
I wrote the
idea.
script.
The script, beautiful. Okay. In that script, you said something that I thought was a beautiful thing to say, which was two approaches you can take to reading Ulysses, especially for the first time. You can either read through it and simply enjoy the language, enjoy it, or you could bring your shovel and try to really dig out, everything. I know you are a digger, but now I'd like to ask Sam, the person who just reads for enjoyment, is there a particular episode or section in Ulysses that you just enjoy reading because it's beautiful and you love it?
There are quite a few. It all. I mean, again, it's to some extent it does depend what mood I'm in. So the thing with the earlier episodes where you have less in the way of, say, stylistic pyrotechnics, but there are, is what you said earlier, beautifully crafted sentences, just very well put together. Hades, the cemetery chapter, is a very good example of that. Even a chapter that doesn't get much love, Lotus Eaters, has some beautiful sentences within it, just in terms of describing the experience of walking through a city and recording haphazard thoughts of someone as they're going through a city. Lestrygonians has some beautiful sentences as well. I like Eumaeus a lot, although that's kind of maybe more of it's an acquired taste. That it's kind of because it's bad writing written well. It's someone of a great ear for dialogue, but trying to deliberately undermine every precept of so-called, proper writing, and it's a hoot because of that.
Absolutely. Yes, I love the way you put that perfectly. It's bad writing done well. I'm going to use that from now on. That's fantastic. Well, Sam, you've been absolutely wonderful in providing this amazing conversation for us. I'll be putting links in the episode notes section for your works. But is there anything you can tell our audience in terms of any other projects you're currently working on, or any place that they can read more about you?
I got it's heavy. This thing, the new annotations to Ulysses, it's just out and it's heavy. That was like a 5-year project with two colleagues, Mark Mamagonian and John Turner. We're already compiling corrections for the next edition. So there's that. Then at the moment, I'm dealing with the big symposium in 2 months, and then then I don't really have anything too big beyond that.
That sounds like plenty. It sounds like enough, honestly. And it's good. It's good for students, of course, to hear that writing is always an ongoing process. We're always editing and rethinking. So that's fantastic. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Sam Slote. If you're thinking of reading Ulysses for the first time, remember, at its core, it's a piece of art. Enjoy it for the beauty and wonder of the language. You don't need to grapple with it and understand every part of it. In fact, I don't understand every part of it myself. But I do love Joyce's play with words. Until next time, try to keep one foot firmly planted on neutral ground. And have a great day.